Imagine discovering that one of the greatest leaders of the early church was just a shy young man when it all began. Timothy's story in the Bible goes far beyond what most people know. While many see him as merely a secondary figure in Paul's letters, the truth is that this young biblical leader became one of the most powerful figures of faith in early Christianity. But here's what will surprise you. Timothy faced doubts, fears, and even health problems that nearly made him give up. How then did an insecure young man become a model of Christian leadership who inspires millions to this day? In this video, you will discover secrets about who Timothy was that few know, including a biblical revelation at the end that will completely change your perspective on faith and youth. Get ready, because Timothy's biblical biography is about to show you that God can use anyone, regardless of age or limitations. And maybe, just maybe, you'll recognize a little bit of yourself on this extraordinary journey. When you hear the name Timothy, what comes to mind? For many, he's just a shadow in the pages of the New Testament. A young man mentioned here and there, overshadowed by the greatness of Paul, Peter, or John. But this perception is completely wrong. Timothy in the Bible was not a supporting character. He was the protagonist of one of the most impressive spiritual transformations ever recorded. A biblical character whose story of resilience and faithfulness spanned centuries. The truth is that Timothy represents something that we have all been at some point. Someone young, insecure, full of potential, but doubting whether he really has what it takes to make a difference in the world. And here begins a journey that will show you how God takes these seemingly ordinary people and transforms them into giants of faith. Because the biblical story of Timothy isn't about perfection, it's about transformation. Are you ready to discover that you may have more in common with this young biblical leader than you realize? Close your eyes for a moment. Imagine a simple house in Lystra, deep in Asia Minor. The sun is setting, tinting the mud walls with golden hues. Inside, a grandmother named Lois holds the hands of a boy with curious eyes and a receptive heart. The aroma of fresh bread mingles with the incense that rises like a silent prayer. His mother, Eunice, watches tenderly as the matriarch's experienced voice recounts the sacred stories. The boy, Timothy, absorbs each word like dry land absorbs rain. This is how one of the future exemplars of young men in the Bible grew up. Not in palaces or prestigious academies, but in an atmosphere saturated with genuine faith. According to Scripture in 2 Timothy 1:5, faith dwelt first in his grandmother Lois, then in his mother Eunice, and finally took deep root in Timothy's heart. What a powerful lesson for our times. In an age when many young people seek inspiration in empty spaces, Timothy's story reminds us that true foundations are built in the home, in family, and in the transmission of eternal values from generation to generation. But don't think it was easy. Timoteo grew up in a mixed family, a converted Jewish mother and a pagan Greek father. He knew what it was like to live between two worlds, to feel divided, to question his identity, just like many young people today. And it was precisely this experience of not quite fitting in anywhere that God would use to prepare him for something extraordinary. Because when you learn to navigate between different realities, you develop something precious, the ability to reach people. But someone was about to arrive in Lystra, someone who would forever change the destiny of this seemingly ordinary young man. And maybe you need that same person in your life today. And then came the day that would divide Timothy's life into before and after. Paul, the great apostle, set foot in Lystra during his second missionary journey. Imagine the impact. The man who would write 2 personal letters to Timothy was there, in his city, preaching the gospel with supernatural power. But here's what many don't realize. Paul didn't choose Timothy because he was perfect or because he demonstrated obvious leadership. Acts 16:1-2 tells us that he had a good reputation among the brothers. That is, he was known for his sincerity and character, not necessarily for his great deeds. This should encourage each of us today. God isn't looking for superheroes. He's looking for willing hearts, people of integrity, young people willing to say yes, even when they don't feel qualified. And that's exactly what he saw in Timothy. When Paul invited Timothy to join the mission, imagine the whirlwind of emotions. Fear, excitement, insecurity, dreams, all mixed together in the heart of a young man who barely knew he was about to become one of the closest disciples of the greatest missionary in history. And here's a truth that will impact your life. Timothy's life-changing encounter with Paul didn't happen because he was special. It happened because he was available when God passed through his life. The question is, when God passes through your life, will you be available? The transformation was swift and radical. Paul's disciple Timothy left behind his comfort zone in Lystra and plunged into a world of missionary adventures, persecution, miracles, and unimaginable challenges. But it wasn't just a geographic shift, it was a revolution of purpose. In his travels with Paul, Timothy was not merely an observer. He actively participated in preaching, discipleship, and church planting. Paul sent him on independent missions, entrusted him with enormous responsibilities, and treated him as both a son and a partner. And for those of you who are watching this far, why not leave a like and subscribe to the channel? Because stories like this deserve to be shared with more people who need to discover their purpose in God. The Bible records Timothy being sent to strengthen the churches in Macedonia, to resolve conflicts in Corinth, to establish order in Thessalonica. A young man who just a few years earlier had been unknown in Lystra now carried apostolic authority over entire cities. What a powerful lesson for our generation. How many young people today think they have to wait decades to make a difference? Timothy proves to us that God can accelerate processes when he finds a willing heart. He became a model of faith not because of his years of experience, but because of his total availability. But being young in a position of spiritual leadership isn't easy, and the challenges Timothy would face next would test not only his competence, but his very identity as a servant of God. Imagine the pressure. You're under 25, and you have to lead men in their 50s and 60s who have lived much longer, traveled more, and know more about life. This was Timothy's daily reality as a young biblical leader in first-century Christian communities. 1 Timothy 4:12 records Paul's urgent counsel, "Let no one despise your youth." Why did Paul need to write this? Because Timothy was clearly facing resistance, questioning, perhaps even belittlement because of his age. But here's what made all the difference. Timothy didn't try to pretend to be older or more experienced than he was. Instead, he set an example in speech, conduct, love, faith, and purity. He made up for his lack of age with an abundance of character. This is a revolutionary lesson for young people today. You don't have to be 40 to impact the world. You don't have to wait until you have everything figured out to start making a difference. What you need is what Timothy had, the courage to be authentic, and the faith to trust that God honors willingness, not age. But the leadership challenges were just the beginning. Timothy was about to receive something that would change not only his life, but the lives of millions of Christians throughout history. Personal letters from the Apostle Paul himself, written specifically for him. And hidden within those letters was one of the most powerful revelations about Christian leadership you will ever hear. 2 letters, 1 and 2 Timothy. Words written by Paul specifically for this young leader, but which became an eternal treasure for the entire church. Paul's letters to Timothy were not just personal correspondence. They were a manual for spiritual leadership, a guide to Christian character, and a testament of faith. In his first letter, Paul writes as an experienced mentor directing his successor. Fight the good fight of faith, 1 Timothy 6:12. Be an example to the believers, your 1 Timothy 4:12. Each instruction was like a chisel, shaping the character of a future giant of faith. But it is in his second letter that we find Paul at his most vulnerable, his most human. Writing from a Roman prison near death, he pours out his heart to Timothy as a father to a beloved son, for I know whom I have believed. 2 Timothy 1:12. Imagine receiving personal letters from the greatest apostle in history. But here's what we must understand. Those words weren't just for Timothy. Through him, Paul was speaking to all of us who face doubts, fears, pressures, and leadership challenges. When Paul writes, "God has not given us a spirit of fear, but of power, love, and a sound mind," 2 Timothy 1:7, he wasn't just encouraging Timothy, he was establishing an eternal principle. God equips those he calls, regardless of how they feel. But there was something in these letters that revealed a side of Timothy few know, a side you might recognize in yourself. Here's a truth that will set many free. Timothy had health problems. Paul literally recommends that he drink a little wine for his stomach's sake and because of his frequent illnesses. 1 Timothy 5:23. He wasn't an invincible superhero. More than that, Timothy struggled with shyness, insecurity, and sometimes discouragement. Paul had to remind him repeatedly to stir up the gift of God that was in him. 2 Timothy 1:6. This means that the fire sometimes dimmed, the passion sometimes cooled. What a relief to know this. How many people today feel they can't serve God because they have physical limitations, because they're shy, because they sometimes feel discouraged? Timothy's story screams loudly. God uses fragile vessels to show that the power is his, not ours. Timothy's testimony of faith was not in the absence of weaknesses, but in his constant choice to serve despite them. Every time he preached while timid, every time he led while young, every time he ministered while frail, he was proclaiming, "God is greater than my limitations." And it was precisely this combination of human frailty and divine power that made him the extraordinary leader he was yet to become. Because God had even greater plans for this young Christian role model. Get ready to discover how Timothy became not only a disciple, but also a pastor of one of the most important churches of the time. Ephesus, one of the most important cities of the ancient world, a commercial, cultural, and religious center. And who did Paul choose to pastor the church of this metropolis? Timothy, the shy young man from Lystra, now had under his care one of the most influential Christian communities of the time. But it was no easy task. The church at Ephesus was under attack by false teachers, dangerous heresies, and internal divisions. Timothy needed to exercise discipline, confront doctrinal errors, and restore biblical order. The insecure young man had become a spiritual warrior. Here we see Timothy's full maturity as a model of Christian leadership. He was no longer the young man who needed constant encouragement. Now he was the one encouraging others, making difficult decisions, and protecting God's flock from wolves in sheep's clothing. And you know what's most impressive? Timothy never lost his essence. Even in a position of authority, he remained humble. Even when dealing with great responsibilities, he maintained a sensitive heart. Even when facing opposition, he preserved his genuine love for people. This teaches us that true Christian leadership is not about power, but about service. It's not about being served, but about serving. Timothy, the pastor of the early church, modeled something our generation desperately needs to see: leadership based on the character of Christ. But Timothy's story had yet to reveal its greatest impact. The legacy he would leave would span centuries and reach you today. And so we reach the climax of this extraordinary journey. Timothy, from an unknown young man in Lystra to a pillar of the early church, had become much more than a successful leader. He became an eternal symbol that God uses ordinary people for extraordinary things. Consider the impact. Millions of pastors over 2,000 years have read Timothy's letters seeking guidance. Countless young people have found courage in his story. Entire generations of Christian leaders have been inspired by his example of faithfulness. But Timothy's legacy goes beyond his achievements. It lies in the living proof that you don't have to be perfect to be used by God. You don't have to have everything figured out to begin your journey. You don't have to be the strongest, the most eloquent, or the most experienced. Timothy, an example for today's youth, teaches us that God seeks availability, not ability. He seeks faithfulness, not perfection. He seeks willing hearts, not impressive resumes. And when he finds these qualities, he does the impossible. Timothy's biblical story proves something revolutionary. Your age doesn't determine your impact, your limitations don't define your potential, and your fears don't have to control your future. If God could transform a shy young man into a giant of faith, what can he do with you? This is the burning question. What if God is looking at you just as he looked at Timothy? What if your insecurities, your fears, your limitations weren't obstacles, but the perfect material for him to demonstrate his power? Because here's the revelation I promised at the beginning. The difference between you and Timothy isn't in your potential. It's in your willingness to say yes when God calls. Timothy's testimony of faith began with a simple decision to follow Paul when he passed through Lystra. How many opportunities has God placed before you that you let pass you by out of fear? How many times has he tried to use you, but you felt too young, too inexperienced, too fragile? Timothy's story screams, these are exactly the qualifications God seeks. Today, at this moment, God is looking for young people like Timothy, people willing to step out of their comfort zone. Hearts open to learning, humble spirits ready to grow, and maybe, just maybe, he's looking right at you. So here's my challenge. Stop waiting until you feel ready. Stop thinking you need more time, more knowledge, more courage. If God is calling, the time is now. If he's pointing a direction, the time is now, because the church today needs Timothys like you. The question isn't whether you have what it takes. The question is, do you have the will? Because if you do, God will take care of the rest. And who knows, maybe years from now, someone will be telling your story as an example that God still transforms ordinary young people into eternal beacons of faith and leadership. Timothy's journey teaches us that the greatest leaders are not born. They are shaped by a willingness to serve, the courage to grow, and the faith to trust God to complete what he began in us. If this story touched your heart, start today. Seek a mentor like Timothy had in Paul. Cultivate a genuine relationship with God like he learned at home. And most importantly, say yes when God calls you to something that seems bigger than you. Leave a comment. What aspect of Timothy's story impacted you most? Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications for more biblical stories that will transform your perspective on faith and leadership. And share this video with someone who needs to discover that God has extraordinary plans for seemingly ordinary lives. Remember, Timothy's biblical story proves that young people in the Bible with faith can become role models for Christian leadership for their generation and future generations. May your testimony of faith begin today, because the world doesn't need more people waiting for the perfect opportunity. It needs more Timothys, young people willing to trust that in God's hands, limitations become qualifications, weaknesses become strengths, and impossible dreams become transformative realities. May God use you as he used Timothy, and may your story inspire others to discover that they too can be the next beacon of faith that will change the world.